on the blockade, that's certainly a big part of the overall scheme of things. But in terms of the Southern shipbuilding effort, they laid down many of these vessels, which were the ironclad vessels with the coal-fed engines. But most of those were never completed. Every time they got close to completion, it seemed the Union would show up to destroy it or capture the ships. So that really wasn't a very effective endeavor. And as I said, they largely dropped the idea of buying ships from Europe, whether it was because Great Britain wouldn't provide them with the ships because of politics, or whether they weren't willing to pay the money that would have gotten them the ships, maybe through surreptitious means. And some of the ships that they did receive were through surreptitious means, where they would buy a ship and then bring it out to sea, and then another ship would show up with the guns and combine the two to create warships. One of the big problems that we've discovered in our research that's in this book and in some of our articles is that the Confederate policy was not only productive in the sense of building ships to test the blockade fleet, but it was actually mostly counterproductive. And this is something we label in the book, and it's the title of one of our articles in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. The Confederate blockade of the South, where the South refers to the Southern economy, and where the Confederacy refers to the Confederate government. Essentially, what we find is that they were making a bad situation worse. In other words, the blockade was a bad situation for the Southern economy, and Confederate policy essentially made things worse. And so what we did was we looked at some of the policies that are either directly or indirectly related to the blockade, and see what economic theory would predict would happen. So what would these policies cause? And then, of course, we looked at the evidence to see if theory was guiding us in the right light in the sense of understanding this particular historical episode. One of the things we look at that occurs at the beginning of the war is the policy of impressment. Impressment is a policy where basically the government grants itself the right to buy your goods at whatever price they decide. Not what price it's worth, not what price you would agree to, not the price that's actually in the market, but the price that they set. And very often, officers of the Army would basically take your products and give you a certificate that says the Confederate government owes you so much money. So they're buying goods at below market prices. Now, whenever you have a situation where a big buyer gets to buy products at below market prices, that sends negative signals to the producers of these products. So if the Confederate government is buying grain at half the market price, grain producers are going to be discouraged from growing more grain. Whatever's left over, of course, is actually going to pump up the market price because there's less left for the civilian population. It also creates a lot of bad feelings. And when a government is going to war, the last thing you want is for your population to have bad feelings towards the government. You don't want that. You want people to feel good about your government. You want them to feel patriotic. You want all the support possible, and you don't want any dissension in the ranks of the civilian population. So you get bad feelings, you get lower supply in the future because suppliers are being discouraged, and people are even reluctant to bring their products to market. And the problem with that is if you're a farmer in the South during the Civil War and you're out in the country someplace and you're growing grain and raising hogs and, raising chickens and all this kind of stuff, the officers of the Confederate government may never come to your place. So they never get a chance to really take your stuff at below market prices. But if you bring them into market, where the Confederate government is and where the Confederate officers are, they may take it away from you. So people are even reluctant to bring it to market. And so it may go to waste, or it may just not get used at all. And I think that this had a detrimental effect on some of the Southern war effort, in the sense that very often some of the worst situations for the Confederate government, for the South, was when the Army would get trapped, right? When the Army would get trapped in a place like Vicksburg. And what happened? Well, they didn't have enough food to survive the holdout, or the being surrounded by Grant's army and by Sherman's army. It turns out there was tons and tons of food and provisions in the countryside, which is how Grant and Sherman survived. So this is just an isolated example that I'm going through here, but I think it's worthwhile. It's something that's not in the book, but I think it's pretty instructive. Okay. This is the Mississippi River. My art teacher would be so proud. And this is Vicksburg. Now, the problem with attacking Vicksburg is it was well defended. Militarily, it was well defended. They couldn't breach the city of Vicksburg under really almost any circumstances. And also, in addition to this, there were tributaries and I think like swampland that made it very difficult to get to Vicksburg. There was a railroad line and a way in, but they tried that before. They tried the land route, and what would happen would be the Southerners would go behind their backs, cut off their supplies, destroy the railroad, and Grant would have to turn back around and go back up to Memphis, up here someplace. So, and they couldn't really use this side of the river, and so this was basically their only way in where they could keep a large army, 50 to 100,000 soldiers involved in this effort to capture Vicksburg and open up the entire Mississippi. This was part of the Anaconda Plan, remember? That we would surround, the Union would surround the South, cut the Mississippi through so that they would control that, along with all of the cotton growing area that would entail. And so at that point, the Union would have possession of all of the best cotton land and the ability to export it back to the north through New Orleans, which they had already captured. And it would prevent reinforcements and commodities moving from the trans-Mississippi territory of the Confederacy, basically Louisiana, parts of Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, and so on. So what Grant does is he decides on a very, very unusual strategy. He's going to get his ships with his soldiers and a big armada, and he's going to run them past Vicksburg. And Vicksburg has guns trained on these things, but still, ironclad ships could get through. But prior to this strategy, they didn't want to get through. They didn't want to get past Vicksburg and then have to go back up. That's no good. Eventually you're going to lose ships going past there. They wanted to knock out Vicksburg. But what he did was he landed the troops. Tens and tens of thousands of troops behind enemy lines, essentially cut off without any provision for new supply. But what they were able to do is live off all this land. And they were able to live off the land. They were able to live off what all of the commodities, all of the foodstuffs that were available on all the farms. But very little of that had been brought into Vicksburg. And, of course, the Confederate Army there held out for quite a while. But it was reduced to basically no rations, very little food. The soldiers were starving to death. And so they had to surrender. I think they surrendered on July 3rd or 4th, 1863. Is that right? The same day as Gettysburg.
Father of waters goes untranquil to the sea, as Lincoln said.
Yes. Well, it was an important moment. It was probably one of the pivotal moments of the land battle. But basically, it was the loss resulted from the fact that Grant and Sherman could live off the land. The soldiers could not. If all of those provisions had been brought into Vicksburg, those soldiers could still be fighting out there in Vicksburg. And Grant would have never been able to breach the city without massive, massive casualties. So when you say impressment, you first start thinking, oh, that doesn't seem like that would have much to do with anything. But in reality, I think it plays a pivotal role in events and in the economy. Now,
that's a real meaning for the word investment, which usually means taking sailors off another guy's ship.
Well, yeah, you can, and that can be conscription too. But impressment is any time the government is basically taking things without paying for them or without paying the full market price.
One question.
Yes.
Was there a vote in the country, or I mean, was there a representation to their representative, the Confederate, about the lawfulness of this? And did the Confederate Congress accede to the idea that the government should take the commodities at low prices?
Well, that's actually a good, interesting question, Ozzy. Now, the Confederate Congress did create this law, but I don't know what happened in subsequent, legal proceedings, because I'm almost positive, like in any other case, that legal proceedings would have resulted from this kind of law because of abuses of the law. And there's a lot of commentary that this policy, in certain places, would break down into sheer robbery, where the military officers would, not be taking things because they were necessary, but taking things because they just wanted to take them, and they had the authority to do so. And so the military, in some cases, would take too much. They would hoard these resources. They would waste some resources because they had this extraordinary legal authority, power, to get resources at much reduced rates.
Again, I think the Confederacy had to go back to the states to get stories about Georgia here. These so many uniforms, but they were go to Georgia soldiers, and they would run out for anybody else. So they made a little bit of that.
Oh yeah, yeah. And Georgia was a leader in provisioning its troops. Apparently, the government and the governor of Georgia was more emphatic about states' rights, and so he and a couple of the other governors were on the front lines in terms of advocating states' rights and trying to block the Confederate government from doing certain things. And so they were very activist when it came to provisioning their soldiers. That's definitely true. One of the things that the Confederate government did at the beginning of the war was they impressed ships. After the foreign ships left the South at the beginning of the war, there were only about 10 ocean-going iron-based ocean-going ships. Now, these all could have been used for trade if they had been put to that use. They could have been outfitted like a blockade runner and put to use running Confederate cotton to Europe and bringing things back, like marine engines and weapons and weapon building equipment that would have been very easy to get into. Yeah, exactly. And like we have here on the Auburn campus. They could have gotten that stuff in on just one or two runs would have made a big difference at the beginning of the war. If they could have brought in heavy capital equipment into the South, that would have made a big difference. And remember, at the beginning of the war, the blockade was mostly a paper blockade. So there were a lot of open ports and not many Union vessels patrolling. But they were all impressed either by state navies or by the Confederate Navy, and they were almost all not put to any good use at all. Most of them really didn't do anything during the war, and so they were wasted and very often destroyed. Amongst the best ships, the biggest and most powerful of the ships, one was sunk as an obstruction in the James River to protect Richmond against any possible naval run at the city of Richmond. That may or may not have been a good idea. Another one was used for the Confederate Naval Academy to train sailors. I think that was probably a particularly nonsensical use to train sailors for ships you don't even have, and you're using one of your best ones in that capacity. Another one, the Nashville, I think it was, really wasn't of any use to the war effort until after it was sold back to private interest in 1862. So not only did impressment really do anything for the war effort, really it was a waste of resources, but it also would have discouraged anybody from trying to bring new ships in. I mean, if the Confederate government has the authority to confiscate new ships, then by running a new ship into the Confederacy, you're putting yourself at a lot of risk, a lot of cost, and you may end up just losing your ship to the impressment policy. Now, another thing that was done was that the governments actually got into the business of blockade running. The Confederate government and the state governments got into the business of running the blockade themselves, competing against the blockaders. And any time government comes in and competes with private enterprise, the private enterprise people get pretty nervous because they know that the government can operate at a loss and drive down your profits and essentially ruin your business. They can ruin your business simply by being in business. And so that was also a problem. Later on, the Confederate government would declare that 50% of all cargo space on blockade runners had to be allocated to the Confederate government. So this further discouraged private blockade running. As a matter of fact, a lot of private blockade runners made special deals with state governments to become state enterprises, of the state of Georgia or North Carolina. They were really private enterprises, but they wanted to be called state enterprises so they wouldn't have to be subject to that Confederate 50% of your cargo, because the state ships were essentially supposed to be immune to that tax. The case in the book here in chapter 2 of the Little Ada, which was a blockade running ship out of Savannah, I believe, is very instructive here. Governor Brown of Georgia refuses to allow the Confederate government to get 50% of the cargo space on this blockade runner, the Little Ada. As a result of that, President Davis refuses clearance to allow Little Ada to leave harbor, because the Confederate soldiers are guarding the entrance to the harbor. So Governor Brown doesn't let the Confederates use the ship. So the Confederates say, well, if you're not going to get to leave the harbor, we'll fire on you.
I thought Davis was a great proponent of states' rights. And so he's up against the state of Georgia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, these are politicians.
Yeah.
And, you may be a great person for states' rights if you're the senator from Mississippi, but if you find yourself as president of the Confederate States, all of a sudden your little deal starts to change. We see that in politicians all the time. A governor from Texas, for example, may say certain things while he's governor, but if he becomes president of the United States, all of a sudden he looks like it's day and night. George.
And Jefferson's Louisiana purchase violate all his states' rights.
Oh yeah, limited government. You have to have the authority to do everything, and he just said, well, it looked good at the time, so I just acquired, something of 1 billion square acres. So that kind of thing happens all the time. But so this ship, this Little Ada, is in the harbor, and while the Confederates and the Georgians are debating all this issue back and forth between the capitals, the Yankees come in and capture the ship.
What kind of war was this? Middle part, or where in the war were they?
I think this was middle late period.
Yeah.
And so the Yankees see an opportunity. This boat is just sitting there, loaded down with cargo, without much crew there because they don't have the authority to leave. So they come in and take the ship.
They cut it out like the British used to do in the French.
No, they tried to run it. They tried to run it out of the harbor, but they found that the Confederates were blockading it in, so they had to turn around and run back out the way they came. So, that gives you some idea of the state of what the states and the Confederates were up to with respect to trade. Now, when we get into 1864, the Confederate government becomes a lot more draconian with respect to trade. In February of 1864, the Confederate Congress is in session, and they're getting desperate. But both sides are actually getting pretty desperate at this point. Lincoln is also had a lot of troubles. He's facing re-election, so things are bad on both sides. In 1864, in February, the Confederate Congress passed a prohibition on importing luxury goods. Now, like the policy impressment, I forgot to mention, with impressment, historians have always said, it was a good policy, but it was just too little too late. They just didn't do enough impressing to give the supplies to the army. So historians think that impressment was a good idea, but they just didn't do enough of it. And likewise, with this prohibition on luxury goods, you very often find them saying, this is a good idea, but they did it too late in the war. They should have done it right away. And they should have eliminated many, many more luxuries than they actually eliminated. And we provide a list in the book, in chapter 2, page 50 and 51, of all the things that were prohibited, large classes of things, all kinds of alcohol products, all kinds of jewelry items, perfumes, paintings, playing cards, clothing, wines, manufactured good glasses, dolls, toys, cabinets, household furniture, the list goes on and on. Well, in economics, in contrast to the historian's view, in economics, this kind of prohibition on luxury goods had a doubly negative effect. One of the things that was really unnoticed or unknown to the Confederate Congress, with a lot of these luxury goods came into the South in the hands of the blockading running crew. Okay, so it wasn't necessarily the cargo of the ship. It was the crew's own stuff. If you're on a crew,
They bought it on their own.
right, they bought it on their own.
Free enterprise.
Well, now it's very, very important. Now you're on the crew of a blockade running vessel. And you get to bring your own bag on board. Okay? You get a little space for your own stuff. That's true on any ship. They have to have place for stuff. Now, they really didn't need it on a blockade running thing because you would just go from Nassau to Wilmington in 1 or 2 days. And sailors don't have to change their clothes or anything like that. So, but what they did was they would have these luxury items in their hold or in their bag. So they would be bringing in, prized goods, luxury goods, medicines, playing cards, all sorts of things, tea and coffee. And then when they got to port, they would sell those things on their own account. And that essentially was their profit. So their rationale for doing this, the captain and the crew, was based not as much on pay as it was on this idea that you could bring your own stuff in and you could make a lot of profit off of it. So this really took away a lot of the incentive of the captain and the crews. It also cut off the whiskey supply. Wine, whiskey, alcohol, products of all sorts. And many states passed prohibitions on making alcohol because they thought, well, we need the grain for bread. We need to sustain the local population with bread. If we started, making whiskey with it, well, that's frivolous and, people might get upset and so on and so forth. So alcohol was in very short supply. And, when you first think about it, this is wartime. You don't need alcohol. You shouldn't be drinking anyways. I mean, this is a serious situation. But, of course, that ignores the fact that alcohol is very important for military effort. Not in terms of getting the troops juiced up, but just in the fact that alcohol has traditionally been in the rations of all armies and all navies. Until modern times, alcohol, and the classic example is the rum ration for the British Navy. It's a compact way of carrying around lots of calories in a little thermos or a little jug or a little something. You can carry around the equivalent of a whole giant bag of bread in a little liquid container of alcohol. It doesn't have a lot of nutrition, but it has the calories there that can sustain troops. It's a morale booster too. There's no doubt about that. And thirdly, it's very important for medicines. It's very important for the medical profession in terms of sterilization. Of course, they didn't know much about that. In terms of reducing pain, there was a lot of amputations, and they didn't have a lot of great anesthesia at the time. And alcohol was often used to dull pain. And thirdly, most medicines were produced in some form or another with alcohol. Tinctures and all sorts of medical drugs were required.
doctor, I would say, looking at the armamentarium of medicine between 1850 and 1860, I think the people in the countryside making their own medications, in other words, boiling down willow bark and things like that, effectively, except when you're looking at 10,000 or 20,000 men or something, but they, in the South, I'm sure a lot of them made homemade medicines that were every bit as good as the commercial product.
Sure.
And they did, for a long time. One other thing I want to mention, I was reading about the Battle of Antietam, and as the Union soldiers were going toward the battle, and Lee and McClellan were getting together, these soldiers were coming off of the first battle before Antietam that they had actually won and felt good about. And as they were marching through the country, Maryland country, they looked at these dead Confederate soldiers, and they all, a lot of them remarked that, what a terrible thing, these guys are killing themselves. They really had a lot of respect for the Confederate soldiers, considering the supplies they had and the equipment they had, and standing up against the Union, and already in the end of 1862, they were already feeling the effects of starvation.
Yeah.
And these guys.
Now, Ozzy, you're using your medical expertise here to get off into these battles. We're staying away from these battles now.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But the point about the medicine is correct. A lot of the medications could have been produced in the South, and a lot of that would have been greatly amplified if people had access to alcohol, which they didn't. Now, except for the quinine, I don't think they could make that, and that was something that was actually brought in through the blockade in pretty good numbers because people needed it so badly for malaria. Now, in 1864, February, they also had a regulation on trade. This is when the 1/2 of the cargo space requirement comes into play, so that the Confederate government is essentially commandeering half of your cargo space. Now, you still got to export cotton. I mean, you were still going to be exporting cotton, but you were going to be doing it for the Confederate government. Now, one of the things we looked at here to try to see what would be the result of this is we looked at Wilmington, North Carolina, which before February of 1864, there were some open ports in the South. After 1864, Wilmington was one of the very few that was opened on the eastern seaboard. So it was the only game in town, so to speak, after this cargo requirement was put into place. Also, after February of 1864, there were a lot of new ships that were coming online. The Confederate government had ordered some blockade-running ships, which were put into service, and a lot of private blockade runners had acquired new blockade-running ships that were faster, sleeker, and better blockade-running ships. So we would have expected to see the number of blockade runs in and out of Wilmington to be much greater after February of 1864. And it turns out it was only about the same number. So you have fewer ports to run into, more ships to do the running, and yet the runs stayed the same. And so we think that that's good evidence that this requirement where the Confederate government gets 1/2 of your ship, combined with the fact that you're not allowed to run in luxuries, was the reason that they didn't get any excess or any increase in runs. February 1864, another piece of legislation also established price controls on imported goods. So there was a whole class of goods, mostly clothing and textiles, that the Confederate government said, you can bring it in, but you can only charge so much for it. So that was a big disappointment to the blockade runners. Now, how did the blockade runners think about this? Well, that's actually a pretty good piece of evidence. It's not necessarily reliable. I mean, business people, if you say, well, what do you think of the government? How do you like your taxes? Of course they're going to complain. It's always a bad thing for you. So, you're never getting a fair deal. You're either getting rooked or you're getting some kind of special deal. So we went and we looked at prominent blockade runners who wrote their memoirs and had official records of what they said at the time as to how they felt, to see if it complied with what we thought was, would be told based on our understanding of economic theory. Well, Captain Roberts was one of the most successful blockade runners during the Civil War. But after this 1864 legislation, he ceased all blockade running activities, saying, quote, "The game, indeed, was fast drawing to a close. Its decline was caused in the first instance by the impolitic behavior of the people at Wilmington, who, professedly acting under orders from the Confederate government at Richmond, pressed the blockade runners into their service to carry out cotton on government account in such an arbitrary manner that the profit to their owners, who had been put to an enormous expense and risk in sending vessels in, was so much reduced that the ventures hardly paid." So basically what he was saying is, when they're taking your cargo space, that running the blockade was no longer a paying or profitable operation. Now, we also quote from Thomas Taylor. And Thomas Taylor is reputed to be the real life model for Rhett Butler. So this is somebody's memoirs that Mitchell apparently read and absorbed a lot of her character content from this particular person. But he was also a famous blockade runner with close ties to the Confederate government. Let's see. Now, he did continue to run the blockade after Roberts had ceased, after this legislation went into effect. But he had a special deal, a secret deal, with the Confederate government so that he would run in their supplies and be paid handsomely for doing so. So he was sort of an insider with the Confederate government. Let's see, writing to his superiors in January 15th, 1865, he said, "I never saw things look so gloomy, and I think spring will finish them, the Confederates, unless they make a change for the better." And as he put it, had blockade running been encouraged, quote, "Instead of having obstacles thrown in the way, I am convinced that the condition of affairs would have been altered very materially and perhaps would have led to the South obtaining what it had shed so much blood to gain its independence." So, Taylor thought this was the pivotal issue, that the South was falling, or it was doing poorly, but that if blockade running had been encouraged rather than discouraged, that it would have made literally all the difference in the world. As Captain Roberts, our first captain, explained, the enterprise had lost much of its charm. For unromantic as it may seem, much of that charm consisted in making money, which I think is very, 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 very true. It's very, very real. And I think that that's very, very meaningful. I don't think people were running the blockade for their health. It wasn't the most dangerous thing in the world, but as a business enterprise, it was very dangerous. You could make a lot of money. You could also lose a lot of money because of the risks of being captured or destroyed, or just running a blockade running ship at night. You can imagine trying to get into Wilmington Harbor in the middle of the night without, any lights or anything, and ships firing at you. The risks, the currents, yeah.
How many of them were steam powered from the blockade running?
At the beginning of the war, there were a fair number of sailboats, sail-powered boats running. But by the end of the war, almost all blockade running into the major ports was under steam power, coal-fed, steam-powered. They would still use sailboats out of smaller places and that kind of thing, but the sailboats were not very effective against when the other side has steam-powered boats, and they were undependable. If there wasn't wind, you were sunk. And so we saw that at the beginning of the war, but a lot of those ships would get captured and weeded out. And by the end of the war, we're talking basically about sail power boats being out of the picture. Yes?
Mark, this blockade running was largely done by individuals who owned and managed one boat, or did an individual own a number of boats?
That's a good question.
Bigger operation.
That's a very good question. There were a lot of independents, let's say, who were basically a one ship, one craft operation, and they would pick up their cargo in the Bahamas or Bermuda, possibly places like Mexico or Cuba. That didn't happen very often. They needed to make that run. Things were most needed on the eastern seaboard, and Bermuda and Bahamas were the closest to that. And they would run in and sell all that stuff, buy cotton, and run back out to Bermuda, the Bahamas, and then bigger boats would take the stuff to Europe, back and forth to Europe. There were larger companies, most of them southern companies from the south, or firms that developed the blockade running businesses, financial houses, shipping houses, things of that nature, who would attract capital from a large number of individuals and buy several ships running lots of cargo into multiple ports. I think that there was a big advantage to that. You were pooling the risk of investment. You were basically calculating a certain number of your ships would be captured. You would get a certain number of ships captured, whereas the individual, if the ship was captured on the first run, they were out of business and bankrupt. But the larger companies could make more of a science of it. They had the wherewithal to take advantage of market situations, contacts in England, contacts in Bermuda and the Bahamas, agents who were working for them to get the harbor space, the warehousing space. And so I think that those firms, those operations tended to do better and stay in operation longer than the independents did. Although there were some very successful independents who ran the blockade over and over and over again very successfully. They found a way which could not be beaten. For example, running into Wilmington on certain nights with certain weather conditions was almost a sure thing. But you had to know what you were doing. You had to have a pilot on board who knew all the aspects of the harbor and that kind of thing. So it's a very good question, and there was both essentially, but I think there was a big advantage to the larger firms that had multiple boats. Yes. You know, I really don't know. Yeah, no, it'll be weeks. Yeah, probably at least 20 days, but I'm not really sure. The large boats would come unobstructed from England to Nassau, to Bermuda, the Bahamas, places like that. And so they could run slower, they could run heavier. They were basically normal operations. The stuff would get to those places and then be put on the blockade running ships. And the blockade running ships, I think, were, depending upon where they started and where they ended up, they could probably run it in a couple of days. Well,
they get it in the shelter ports in Bermuda and these other places, and then they transport their stuff.
Yeah, if you could run from the Bahamas into Savannah, it could be done in just a couple of days.
One thing, did you ever run across the fact that Matthew Maury, he was a naval officer who was between about 1840 and 1850. He was injured in a stagecoach accident, and he couldn't go on with his career in the Navy, so he became interested in ocean currents. And he plotted these things from about that time to about 1850. Melville based his story on Moby Dick about the whale being in certain areas of the oceans one time of the year and then the other time of the year. And he went over to the south and he took all his data that he could and gave it to the south. So they had an invaluable mass of current tide current things. He was mentioned in this book, A Man Without a Country, by the author, as being one of the arch fiends of the Confederacy because he contributed so much to their shipping.
He was a naval captain, wasn't he? He had his own ship, and I think it was like
the Coast Guard and the coast, like they have now NOAA. He chartered and got all this data together from all around the world. I guess he spent years and years after.
He was the first person to develop those currents. And all that stuff. Yeah. And I think he was a ship captain in on one of those ships that went out to destroy Union commerce, commerce raider. Yeah. And I think if I'm not. I get these fellows mixed up sometimes because the Secretary of the Navy has a very similar name to that. Yeah. But I think he was one of the most successful of the commerce raiders out of the Confederacy. That was another problem they had because they allowed the blockade to become so effective. Their commerce raiders had a hard time of it because if they captured a ship, the idea was you had to bring it back to port to claim your prize. Yeah. And then you'd have to sell it. Oh. But the problem is if you got a commerce ship and tried to run it back into the Confederacy, you have a hard time with it. And a lot of the European powers didn't want to be involved in this, so they didn't have the access of commerce raiding that really might have been the basis of a very effective naval force. Prior to the Civil War, and with the exception of some European powers like England and France, and even in their cases, most naval power was actually in private hands. Larry Seacrest has a wonderful article in a new book out that we have called the book is called The Myth of National Defense, edited by Hans Hermann Hoppe, and he goes back and gives you a very nice summary of some important historical facts, which basically show that most of the fighting, most of the capturing, most of the destroying in terms of naval power was done by private enterprise. And the government's ships were there for shows of authority, shows of force, to support the colonial empires and that kind of thing. But when they went to war with one another, they would authorize these private ships to become part of the public navy.
I mean, the East India Company, they hired ships.
Right.
And early on, they were highly government sponsored. And then, as the thing spread out, they needed more ships, and they would just hire them.
No, I think it's still called the King's Navy.
Yeah,
The Navy.
Well, I tell you, Arch, can you call this the thing?
Which one? Well, this is Civil War, when he was talking about the landing and all those villains that opposed the war. Yeah.
I'll get his name and for the next class. I'll try to remember him. Yes.
Down here in Columbus, what type of boat is that? Armament, guns,
The submarine, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
No, the submarine was not of Columbus. They have a Confederate naval yard here, and they were trying to build ships which were based with wood and then ironclad, so that they were using existing ships. They just weren't very good at making ships, and the only good places were in Virginia, and most of those people left. And Pensacola, the Union maintained control of that throughout the war, and in New Orleans, which the Union got a hold of very quickly. So places like Columbus were the next sort of line of defense, and so they had ships there for repair, but they tried to create these ironclads. But as far as I know, none of them were actually launched into battle, which they would have sent them down the river to Apalachicola. And
That would go all the way from Columbus down to the Gulf, or
I don't know.
what?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah. No, they put cotton down there. Or shallow trout ships.
Yeah, I think that there was something some obstacle that they between Columbus and Eufaula, but I think they had a way around that where they could get around that somehow. These were not large boats, though. These were not going to be going out into the ocean, as far as I know. And
They have a lock system there to get them up and over, or whatever.
not back then, no.
Okay.
Now but it wasn't long after that, though. And so but the Union came in late in the war. Of course, they came through Alabama, through Selma and Montgomery, I think,
Down from the middle
to Auburn.
Mississippi,
No, they're coming from Mississippi, and they're coming from the west to the east. And they basically came through, I think, Selma, Montgomery area, Auburn area, and into Columbus. And I think the ships were sunk by the Confederates because they weren't complete, and they didn't want the Union to get their hands on them. And they were later raised, and are, what's left of them is in the museum. So that was a very common occurrence. They would start these projects. They really weren't very good at making ships. They really didn't have the materials like iron, the type of iron that was needed to withstand a rifled cannon was 2 inches thick. And I think the only place that you could roll 2-inch thick cladding for these ships was in Richmond. And
they'd have to transport it. Oh boy.
yeah, now how do you transport it from Richmond to Columbus? Now you've got railroads, but with railroads, those railroads were busy with other things and they were wearing out. You know, right now we have steel rails that last a good long time. Back then they were iron rails and would wear out like iron horseshoes and have to be replaced, but they didn't have any replacement rails. So they would have to cannibalize part of their railroads in order to keep the existing ones going. Lee said that if we only had a railroad from, I can't remember, one harbor up to Richmond or something where they could have gotten more supplies up there, that he could have held out forever. But there wasn't any, labor or materials to do such a thing because those things just weren't available. So this use of autarky to try to overcome the blockade of trying to produce everything on your own is really self-defeating. It really doesn't get you anywhere. You really can't produce much when you don't have the expertise, when you don't have the resources and the comparative advantage. The British had the comparative advantage in building ships. And of course the Union had a lot of shipbuilding capacity as well. And but the South never really managed to get enough European shipping in its own cause.
The evolution of the ship, the cargo ships and that, from wood to steel frames and wooden decks and things, but as time went on, they were more and more toward the steel that they are today.
Right.
They were part wood and part steel, and steel frame and the wood between. But as you
a lot of
the 20th century, they went towards.
Yeah, almost all of the Confederate efforts to build military ships in the South, they would take wooden hulls and clad them with iron and outfit them, of course, with iron guns and, in many cases, even iron decking.
If you look at visit Vicksburg, the Carroll sits there, it's an iron clad. It's clad with rails. The wooden ship clad with rails. We were fortunate enough to visit England right after visiting Vicksburg. And in Portsmouth, you can see the Warrior, the first steel battleship that the British built when we were fighting the Civil War. And it's a steel ship with a flat deck. It's dumb. It's just a big flat deck with one bridge in it, a little bridge across it, and a bunch of dopey old-fashioned cannon sitting on wooden trucks running on the deck. But the real classy part of that ship is when you go to the engine room. The engine you see there is the engine that's in the Carroll. Admittedly, the Carroll has been fished up out of the river, but the British ship is top of the line. The Industrial Revolution has really made a great engine. And these guys that built the Union buildings, they threw the Carroll together. They built a half a dozen or so of those ironclads.
This is the Confederate ship?
No, this is
the Union
ship.
Okay.
The Confederate sunk all those ships. But this one was sunk right by Vicksburg and brought up. It's a great thing to drive around Vicksburg Park and you can come around the corner and you're looking right at this ship and his guns are looking at it.
Well, the logistics of all this. Which wasn't the best solution, but the Confederates even in Texas, in Galveston Harbor, the Union had taken over Galveston Island and made that a very effective blockade of the Houston area, which was the export-import place for basically all of Texas. Was it had to go through Galveston. And so they took over the island and effectively cutting that off. Well, the Texans outfitted a ship clad in cotton. So they just wired cotton bales all around the outside of the ship. And the Union fired their cannons at it, and it didn't do anything to the ship. So the ship was able to land, get its soldiers off, and they were actually able to retake the island and break the blockade in Texas for quite a while. I'm not sure if they used that opportunity effectively, but the Southerners were very inventive people. They tried everything, and things like technology, things like inventiveness were not the problem. There wasn't anything that the Confederates didn't try in terms of technology. So that's really not the answer. I think the answer is really just this basic resource problem that shows incomes declining and resources declining, all the while Southern capital is being depreciated, whether it's the railroads or the guns that existed in the South that were being worn out. That was all being depreciated, and there was nothing there to reestablish all this stuff. Like another good example of the technology was the submarine. The Confederates built the first submarine. There was a lot of trial and error with that. It was done privately, I believe, and it was successful at sinking a very large ship, and probably would have been more successful if they had continued to do that kind of thing. But I believe it was a privately funded effort, and there was a naval person who was actually in charge of the ship. But other than that, it was a private venture. It was a technological advance, obviously.
They didn't have the technology that the Union shipbuilders had.
No.
They couldn't test stuff and get it all, ready to manufacture. I mean, they just didn't have that. They didn't have that.
They did not have the capital. They did not have the expertise. They did not have the facilities. But they were not.
But they were just as inventive as the Northern inventors. I mean, the Americans.
Yeah.
They could invent anything.
Yeah. So there was no lack of trying. There was no lack of inventiveness or entrepreneurship. They just basically, every time you open a door, you find not enough men, not enough food, not enough iron, not enough resources. It's basically the blockade is doing what the anaconda does. It restricts you, and eventually you run out of breath, and every time you breathe, it gets tighter and tighter. And that's basically what the blockade was able to do, is strangle the Southern economy. So there was no energy, there was no where to go, nowhere to move. And, but things were, as bad as things were, the issue was still in doubt, even late in the war. If they had turned their policy, instead of these stupid things that they did in February of 1864, if they had done the right things, things were not looking good for example, Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1864. Lincoln just barely won that election by a very, very close margin. The Democrats were very strong. There was a candidate running for governor, I think, in Ohio. It was a Peace Democrat. And the Midwest, if the Midwest had walked out on Lincoln, the Union war effort would have been in serious, serious danger. And if two economists, Gary Anderson and Robert Tollison, looked at the electoral situation for that presidential election, found that it was very close, that a small number of votes swung some very important states like Pennsylvania, and that Lincoln actually had to do some very unscrupulous things, he and his generals, to get the vote to come out the way it did. For example, they found a tendency for generals to throw regiments from Democratic areas into battle more often in 1864 and to withhold troops from Republican areas. There's also, they talk about misreporting the votes and things of that nature, sending troops home, you know, to vote.
The soldier vote that got him in.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Obviously, these guys, you know, it was close, but no cigar. I mean, he could have lost that. And there was a lot of northern people, Vallandigham, and those guys were pulling all kinds of stuff. It's a wonder he, you know, but I think it was a soldier vote.
Yeah. What was that? Anderson and Towson is just a little journal article in a journal called Defense Economics, and there's a quote from them near the end of the chapter, and there's a reference to the article. It's not an obscure journal, but it's a very specialized journal, so it's not going to be something you're going to find at Books A Million, that's for sure. But it might be in the Auburn Library or be available online someplace. It's very, very interesting stuff that they report in there, though, because they're public choice economists. They're always thinking that politicians are, you know, always trying to rig a vote here and there, and so they started looking around and they found some pretty good evidence of that. You know, Lincoln was not sitting back idly, waiting for events to play out. That he and Republican generals and Republican leaders were very active. You know, just as politicians are today. You know, they're always looking for the key state and what's the key issue and what will drive our voters out and what will drive their voters home. You know, if we can just rig that one election, the presidential thing will all fall in our way. And they found pretty much the same thing, except in Lincoln's case, you know, they're finding, you know, essentially them sending the Democrats out to be killed more often than the Republicans, and so it's very interesting. The other people have also looked at that same issue too. You know, the Lincoln's election of 1864 is something a lot of scholars should take another look at. In the Confederacy, you know, the Confederates adopted the U.S. Constitution with some changes, and we're going to look at some of those changes towards the end of this course. One of the things they did differently was they said a president would have a 6-year term and could only have one term in office. So Jefferson Davis could not seek re-election and did not have to seek re-election in 1864. So politically, the situations were very different for Lincoln and for Davis. And politically, things were very different for both North and South, or should I say, both Union government and Confederate government. From the beginning of the war, 1864 and 1865, both of those political climates changed rather dramatically.
Vice President Confederacy was so disillusioned of whatever it was, that after a few months, 6 months, a year, what it was, went to Georgia to stay there for the rest of the war, didn't it?
Yes, Stevens, I think was, well, I mean, Stevens was more idealistic than Davis and everybody else. I'm pretty sure he's a real, true, classical liberal. and who these ideas really meant something to. And he was most interested in establishing peace. And most everybody else was just headlong into the war. And Stevens was making efforts to try to reestablish peace, to negotiate. And as far as he was concerned, the solutions were all open to debate, including re-entering the Union. And no one would really pay attention to him or give him the authority. And I think he did try to negotiate, set up negotiations with the North a couple times, but essentially he was somebody who was not listened to, and his only opportunity would be, basically as he saw it, was if Davis was killed, captured, or died of natural causes. And so I think going back home was his statement that he wasn't going to leave the office, but that he wasn't going to condone what was going on.
To answer your question, to start with, the South should have put incentives in for all privateers to do the gun
Blockade
running, and maybe somebody else from some other country that they have a ship that they want to run. And do you see any connection there with how they're doing with the Halliburton out here? Fair analogy?
Well, yeah, I mean, Halliburton is a government contractor, and in a sense, privateers are government contractors in that they're private and yet they're working for the government. But privateers are a little different, and it's an important sense in that privateers have an incentive. They basically are paying all of the cost of running that ship, of paying those soldiers, and they get all of the benefit of capturing ships and of claiming prizes. Halliburton is much different than that, in the sense that they are getting paid to do a stated task. And so, yeah, they're both privatizing, but they're privatization in a very different form. And the Halliburton type of privatization of government contracts doesn't have the same type of incentive structure. With Halliburton, they're given $1 million, let's say, to supply toilet paper in Iraq. And they might or might not get in trouble if everybody doesn't have toilet paper. But basically that's their job, and they're going to get paid $1 million no matter what. Well, economists see that situation that it has some problems in the sense that Halliburton might not get the toilet paper to the right people at the right time. They might use inferior quality toilet paper, those sorts of things. They'll cut costs in
food and transportation and all of those things for private companies. And they really had an open wallet, didn't it?
Yes, and that's the other thing, is it wasn't bid out.
Privateer is Confederate too, isn't it? On the other hand,
Yeah, they're
they are working for a fee.
right, exactly.
No bid contract.
That's the kind George likes. But notice there are two very, very different types of privatization. Where one is open and costs are controlled for rational reasons, and there's a profit incentive to do a really good job, whereas the other type, the cost incentives are skewed and biased, and there's no incentive to do a really good job. And so those are two different approaches. But I do want to, before we get out of here, I do want to go back to the point that you raised originally, because I think that that was a solution that the Southerners should have, could have, and done, which is, you mentioned just briefly, is to offer prizes for the sinking of blockade ships. If the Southerners offered a significant monetary prize for the sinking of certain ships in these blockade forces out there in front of the harbors, and they had their own, mediocre ships in the harbor, that if they could get somebody like the little submarine that sunk that warship, if you sink a few warships in these blockade fleets, the rest of the blockade fleet is just a bunch of ships. I mean, they're not that powerful. They're not that well armed. They're just ships out there. In fact, some of them were even wooden ships. So, if you sink a few warships and then send your moderate, mediocre Navy ships out there to disperse the rest of the bunch, you've effectively opened your harbor. And that's something that doesn't really cause a big government to be set up. You just say, okay, we're going to pay anybody who can sink the ship, whatever. We'll pay them $25,000 in gold to whoever can sink the ship first. That doesn't cause a lot of big government. And if you open up the harbor to cotton exports and imports, the economy will benefit tremendously, even in the short run. So I think that would have been the best solution possible, the most immediate. You could have done it right off the bat, and it doesn't require any resources other than the gold itself. So I think that would that's about it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid I've talked our way through another hour and a half. And but next week, we're going to move on to the topic of inflation in both the North and the South, which is probably the most important economic phenomenon, amazing economic phenomenon of the war itself.